Let's talk about the different types of variables that one might encounter. In the statistical context, the way to think about what a variable is that when you're trying to measure it, when you ask people a survey question, think about the type of answers that they're allowed to give in your survey to your survey question. For example, if they're able to respond with a number, well, then that's called a quantitative variable. So, for example, if you ask somebody their age or their income or their GRE score, they're going to respond with a number. So that's a quantitative variable. A quantitative variable is also sometimes called a continuous variable. And it might also be a discrete variable. The difference there is whether decimals are allowed or not. So if it can only be a whole number as a response, then it's discrete. But if it could also be a decimal, then it's continuous. But in either case, for the most part, the distinction for most research purposes doesn't matter too much. It's a quantitative variable. A categorical variable, as the name kind of implies, is if their answer is essentially a category. If you were to ask somebody their race, for example, then that's a categorical variable. If you were to ask them if your survey question was like strongly agree, neutral, weakly agree, strongly disagree, etc. If there's like 3 answer options or 5 answer options, again, that's a categorical variable. So another name for categorical variables, by the way, is sometimes called a nominal variable. And that being said, a specific case of a categorical variable that's very common is what we call a binomial variable. It's also sometimes called a binary variable or a dummy variable. So binomial or a dummy variable. And really what it's saying is it's when there's exactly only 2 options. So if your categorical variables has specifically 2 categories, for example, if it's a yes or no question, did you vote, yes or no? Did you go to college, yes or no? Well, then that's an example of a binomial variable, a dummy variable, or a binary variable. So again, essentially, that's sort of the lay of the land as far as the type of variables that you might encounter when you're trying to measure things. And the reason it's sort of important to know the differences is because when you do analyses, you're going to interpret them differently. You're going to even use different tools if it's one type versus the other. By the way, one sort of note on dummy variables is the way we usually enter it in a data set is a common thing to do. Instead of having words like yes or no, we're going to enter it as like a 0 or a 1. So often you'll see like, oh yeah, if they answered a 0, we're going to enter that in Excel as a 0. And if they said yes, we're going to enter that as a 1, for example. So that's, that's just one common thing to do. Even though we're turning these into numbers, it still doesn't make it a quantitative variable because conceptually they could have only given one of 2 numbers or categories as a response, so it's still a categorical variable. Now, let's say that you figured out what type your variable is, but you're trying to make a scatter plot or something like that, right? So you have an x. One of those is an x variable, and one of your variables is a y variable. There's other names that go along with these, so I'm just going to list out the different names. So again, depending on which book you're reading, they might label these slightly differently. So the other name for an x variable is an independent variable. Independent. And the y variable would be a dependent variable. For example, your GRE score depends on the number of hours you studied. And so the independent variable is usually the one that you sort of presumably have some control over, like you get to control the hours studied, and then that causes, the y variable usually to be altered. And so there's that terminology, dependent, independent, x, y. The other name that's common is explanatory and response variable. So the other name for an x variable or independent variable is explanatory. And the corresponding y variable term would be a response variable. So it sort of makes sense, right? Your GRE score is a response to your the the variable that's explaining why people have different GRE scores, which is number of hours that you studied, for example, right? So that's just different terminology to get used to.